The telepathy tapes and facilitated communication, verbal cues in no-touch FC, house, exploring facilitator cueing in a no-touch form of FC. Welcome to another critique of facilitated communication.
Why is it that most of the time, most of the autistic individuals are not looking at the keyboard?
Just a heads up to my regular viewers. First, thank you for your support. I appreciate it. Based on the comments I'm getting from those new to the channel and/or from proponents, I've repeated some information about authorship, FC, and facilitated cueing in this video. I've put timestamps in the description box below this video if you'd like to skip around. Goals of this video: to review the two main categories of facilitated communication, to identify the types and characteristics of the forms of FC used by participants featured in the Telepathy Tapes podcast, to point out facilitator behaviors in a telepathy test that raise concerns about who is controlling the activity, in this case a remote spelling of the word house. Observations from a former facilitator. What follows are my observations as a former facilitator who, unlike 100% of the current-day facilitators, participated in reliably controlled authorship testing in 1993, just 3 years after FC was introduced to the U.S. by Douglas Bicklin of Syracuse University. Before I get to the critique, I'd like to take a moment to share some things I learned about FC after the testing. These are things workshop leaders failed to tell us in the training. What FC workshop leaders didn't tell us. FC was not then, and is not now, an evidence-based technique. Anecdotes and testimonials, aka feel-good miracle stories, are not evidence, though facilitators may sincerely believe in the technique. Reliably controlled tests consistently show that the FC-generated responses are only correct when the facilitators have access to the test stimuli. Question: if the communications are independent, why does the facilitator have to know the answers for it to quote-unquote work? When facilitators are blended from test stimuli, the FC-generated responses are either incorrect, the clients can't spell, unintelligible, the clients don't have letter sound recognition, or correctly spelled with words that have nothing to do with the questions being asked. In other words, facilitator guesses. Most facilitators aren't aware of the extent to which they use physical, visual, and/or auditory cues to influence and control letter selection. Well-intentioned people can be fooled by FC. I stopped using FC after the testing in 1993, but I've continued studying it over the past 30-plus years. I've also been waiting for proponents to conduct reliably controlled studies that address facilitator cueing and prove communication independence with these techniques. I am, and the world is, still waiting. Today's facilitators are taught not to participate in reliably controlled studies designed to separate facilitator behaviors from those of their clients or loved ones. Some facilitators claim it's unethical to test for authorship, but even without the reliably controlled testing, we can learn a great deal about facilitator behaviors through pro-FC movies, YouTube videos, and other media. The Telepathy Tapes. The Telepathy Tapes podcast is currently drawing a lot of attention in the United States for its claims that non-speaking individuals with autism have telepathic abilities. The presenter of the podcast, Kai Dickens, and the experts featured in the podcast, however, downplayed the fact that the autistic individuals featured in the podcast are being subjected to a discredited technique known as facilitated communication. Proponents of FC have yet to provide reliably controlled evidence that the technique leads to communication independence for the individuals being subjected to its use. In fact, the evidence shows that facilitators are often inadvertently controlling letter selection. To date, facilitator authorship and FC-generated messages have only been ruled in, not ruled out, when tests have been conducted under reliably controlled conditions that blind facilitators from test stimuli. In the telepathy tapes, the participants, not the facilitators, were denied access to the pictures, words, and numbers being spelled out using FC. In each test, the facilitators knew the answers to the spelled responses. Promoters of the telepathy tapes seem confused about what constitutes facilitated communication, a technique that was discredited in the United States by 1995. Facilitator-dependent techniques. Facilitated communication, or FC, is an umbrella term that represents all facilitator-dependent techniques, regardless of whether the facilitator holds onto the client or holds onto the letterboard. Over the years, FC has evolved into two main categories, touch-based and no-touch forms of FC. Two main categories of facilitated communication. Touch-based FC. The facilitator supports the child by holding onto his wrist, forearm, elbow, or shoulder, or other body part during letter selection. It's known as supported typing, saved by typing, assisted typing, hand over hand, letterboarding, and others. Minimal or no-touch FC. The facilitator holds a letterboard or stencil in the air while the child extends a finger toward it. Sometimes, but rarely, the child holds onto the keyboard or letterboard, but the facilitator still uses visual or auditory cues to aid in letter selection. It's known as rapid prompting method, spelling to communicate, speller's method, informative pointing, spelling with eyes, and others. Role of facilitators or communication regulation partners. Facilitator role in touch-based FC. Proponent view. Provide physical and emotional support. Steady the motor movements of the individual. Redirect the individual's attention if necessary. Fade support from wrist to shoulder. Presume competence. Don't test. Skeptic view. Facilitators often unwittingly cue their clients in ways that not only influence but control letter selection. Fading support from wrist to shoulder does not eliminate facilitator influence over letter selection. Authorship can be tested by controlling the information the facilitator sees during testing. Facilitator role in no-touch forms of FC. Proponent view. Communication difficulties in autistic individuals are primarily due to motor difficulties and require their support. Cueing cannot occur if the facilitator does not touch the client. There is a mind-to-mind bond between facilitator and child. Skeptic view. Many autistic individuals perform gross and fine motor activities independently and without facilitator interference. So why can't they select letters on a keyboard by themselves? Facilitators, however, unwittingly can cue their clients even when the board is being held in the air with minimal physical touch. FC conversations are one-sided and facilitator-controlled. For more detailed information about FC and all its variant forms, please visit facilitatedcommunication.org or FC is Not Science, my YouTube channel. FC and telepathy. Promoters of the telepathy tapes want us to believe that non-speaking autistic individuals being subjected to FC, S2C, and RPM have telepathic abilities. This is quite an extraordinary claim. But does FC work? Does telepathy exist? Proponent view. FC works because people using FC say it works. Telepathy works because facilitators and parents feel like it works. People who question these beliefs are against people with disabilities. Skeptic view. All reliably controlled tests of authorship to date demonstrate that the facilitator, not the individual being subjected to FC, are controlling the messages. Telepathy testing in FC cannot be determined until authorship is established. Testing for facilitator cues. The key to proving FC authorship and telepathic abilities is to determine whether the spelled responses can be attributed to the autistic individual without external cues from the facilitators. This is most reliably done through carefully controlled message passing tests that are designed to separate facilitator behaviors from those of the individual being subjected to FC. Main categories of facilitator cueing. Physical. Touches by the facilitator on the client's wrist, elbow, shoulder, or other body part, even slight changes in pressure, can influence letter selection. Visual. Movements from the facilitator like head nods, hand signals, and shifts in body weight can signal the client where on the letterboard to touch. Often these movements are inadvertent, but not always. Verbal or auditory. Spoken utterances that signal to the client where on the letterboard to touch, like when the facilitator says the sound of the target letter before the individual touches the board. It should be noted that facilitators may or may not be fully aware of the extent to which these cues influence and control letter selection. Facilitators are even taught in some workshops to prompt their hearts out. Purpose of cueing. Proponent view. To physically and emotionally support the client. To help regulate his or her movements. To help correct and/or prevent repetitive or self-stimming behaviors. Skeptic view. FC, S2C, and RPM don't work without facilitator cues. Individuals are essentially taught to point on cue through repetition and reinforcement of the desired behavior, like pointing a finger toward a letterboard. Any cues by the facilitator should be faded within days, not weeks or years after teaching a client a new skill. A telepathy test. In today's example from the telepathy tapes, the non-speaking autistic individual is sitting on a couch behind his mother, technically in a separate room, but they are within visual range of each other. His mother, acting as facilitator, spells the word house on a piece of paper held in the air and then asks him to spell the word. The original video is 46 seconds long. I've pared it down to 20 seconds and use bits of the same 20 seconds throughout the rest of this critique.
Hold on, I gotta focus. Okay.
Okay, what is this? Huh? 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 Whoa. What is it? Huh?
Half up.
Huh? Huh?
Or shap. Or sadia.
You see, I'm not even looking at him.
Yeah.
Is this a reliably controlled test for telepathic abilities? Proponent view. Yes, her son could not see the word his mother spelled out on a piece of paper. He spelled the word without physical touch and without his mother looking at him. Skeptic view, no. The mother picked the word and wrote it on a piece of paper. The mother used verbal cues to signal to her son how to spell the word. Reliably controlled tests of authorship and/or tests of telepathic abilities rule out external cues, including influence by the facilitator. This test did not. Facilitator behaviors, visual and physical cues. It does not appear that the facilitator used physical or visual cues during this test. Facilitator behaviors, verbal cues. Most people, when they learn about FC, are taught to look for physical and visual cues. However, verbal cues in FC are just as prevalent and aid in the illusion that FC-generated messages are quote-unquote independent. Just like with physical or visual cues, we often miss verbal cues because our attention is focused primarily on the person being facilitated and not on the facilitator. But listen in this next clip as the mother says the letter sounds of the word several times until her son verbally says the word house. I've added speech bubbles to focus your attention on the mother's verbal utterances.
Okay, what is this? Huh? Huh? Whoa. What is it? Huh?
Half up.
Huh?
Or shap. Or sadia.
You see, I'm not even looking at him.
Yeah.
Solomon Mukapedye, inventor of rapid prompting method, a no-touch form of FC, also uses verbal cues with her clients, as this clip from her Soma RPM YouTube channel shows.
Wrote this ballad. So what did he write? my turn. B, your turn. A, my turn. L, your turn. L, and then A and D. Alert.
This type of verbal cueing comes from many hours of practice and is, in and of itself, an impressive feat. However, do these students understand what they are spelling? Or are they just repeating the sounds their facilitators are making without comprehension? Awareness of the problem of cueing in FC. At the end of this clip, the facilitator turns to Kai Dickens, the podcast host, and says, "You see, I'm not even looking at him."
You see, I'm not even looking at him.
Yeah.
To me, this shows that the facilitator has some awareness that facilitator cueing may be a problem. I've been asked if I think the facilitators on the telepathy tapes are purposely cheating. At this point, I don't have any reason to believe the facilitators are anything but sincere in their belief in FC and perhaps even telepathy. However, because she's probably just following the FC guidelines she was taught during training, the facilitator may also be unaware of the extent to which other behaviors, like verbal cueing, hand signals, and body movements, may also influence and control letter selection. Facilitators are taught not to test for competence, aka FC authorship, so it is likely that she has not participated in reliably controlled testing to rule in or rule out her own behaviors during the spelling activities. I think that's why I get so frustrated with the so-called experts featured in the telepathy tapes. They're the ones who should be guiding these parents to seek help from professionals trained in evidence-based communication techniques and legitimate augmentative and alternative communication, not stringing them along with the false promises of pseudoscience. FC was discredited over 30 years ago. Summary. The Telepathy Tapes is a popular podcast claiming that non-speaking individuals with autism have telepathic abilities. The producers of the podcast fail to inform their listeners that the individuals featured in the testing are being subjected to a discredited communication technique called facilitated communication. There are two main categories for FC: touch-based and minimal or no touch. Regardless of which form of FC the spellers in the podcast are being subjected to, there's no reliably controlled testing to prove proponent claims of independent communication among its users. Rather, facilitators, not those being subjected to FC, are likely the authors of the FC-generated messages. Facilitators, though well-meaning, are often unaware of the extent to which they control letter selection through physical, visual, and auditory cueing. Anecdotes and testimonials, though interesting and often where scientific inquiry begins, are not evidence. In today's example of a telepathy test with FC, the mother appears to be using verbal cues to signal to her son which letters of the word house to spell. For this to be a reliably controlled test for FC authorship or for telepathy, the facilitator would need to be blinded from the test stimuli and all external cues eliminated. This telepathy test raises more questions than it answers. Here are a few questions off the top of my head. Put your questions in the comments below this video if you can think of others regarding FC, telepathy, or this test. What would happen to the son's ability to remotely receive and spell out a word if his mother was not allowed to speak during the activity? What would happen to her son's ability to remotely receive the word if his mother was not within visual and auditory range? It appears that the son knew that the letter sounds his mother was making spelled the word house. Is this an activity that the mother and son practiced ahead of time, not as a deception but as part of the FC training? What would happen to his ability to remotely receive and spell a word if it was a word that he was not familiar with? The science. To date, there's no scientifically rigorous evidence to prove facilitated communication, spelling to communicate, rapid prompting method, or any of their variants produce independent communication. Controlled studies show that facilitators, not their clients, are producing the typed messages. Many organizations oppose the use of facilitator-reliant techniques. These include, but are not limited to, American Speech-Language Hearing Association, American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, American Psychological Association, Association for Behavior Analysis, Association for Science and Autism Treatment. These organizations cite the following reasons they encourage their members not to use facilitator-reliant techniques. lack of scientific evidence, prompt dependency, facilitator queuing and control over letter selection, potential harms including false allegations of abuse, lost opportunity costs as individuals are prevented access to evidence-based forms of augmentative and alternative communication. This educational video is intended to draw attention to the problem of facilitator queuing and a technique called facilitated communication. Criticisms of FCS to CRPM or any of their variants contained in this video are not directed at the individuals being subjected to its use. For more information about FC, please visit facilitatedcommunication.org. Please subscribe, like, share, and comment to help grow this project. Thank you for watching until the very end, and remember, FC is not science.